everyone. So over the past 10 years, I think we first saw a great influx in the quantity and the popularity of vampire books and movies that were coming out, of course because of Twilight, but I think with that, in my opinion, it also kind of coincided with the decrease in the quality of those types of books. And I think with that, and especially around the time, say, Twilight was being made into movies, that's when you started to really start to hear people say, I don't like vampires, I don't like vampire books. And I kind of always wondered, had they seen a really great vampire film, had they read a really great vampire book and they just weren't a fan of it, or did they just have Twilight, you know, stuck in the back of their mind and that's what was represented to them as vampires? And I think the latter is the case for most people. Now, I've been a fan of vampires ever since I read Dracula when I was 9, you know, long before Twilight and that kind of whole type of vampires came out. So I'm gonna go through all of the vampire books that I own and talk to you about them. Now with them, I am gonna go over some of the cheesier, you know, for tween vampire books, but at the same time, you know, there's nothing wrong with those books. I think sometimes you need a little bit of cheese in your books, and I know some people would probably really like to read them, so I thought I'd go ahead and talk about that anyways. So in no particular order, I'm gonna go through all the vampire books that I own and make sure to let me know if you guys have your favorite vampire book that you guys really love. So the first book I want to talk about is the modern classic, and that is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. Interview with the Vampire starts off with a young man who is essentially just given up on life, and he is forcibly turned into a vampire by the infamous vampire Lestat. That's actually the name of the second book in this series, which unfortunately I have not read. The setting for this book, I believe, starts off in the 19th or 18th century. I read this a while back, so I can't exactly remember, but I believe it takes place in the 19th or 18th century, and just the setting of New Orleans is perfect for this book. It's just intoxicating and really well written, and I think there's a reason that Anne Rice is kind of known as the queen of vampire books. But there is a reason this one is a classic. And I think the movie version with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, I know originally Anne Rice was like, why the fuck is Tom Cruise playing Lestat? But I think he did a decent job, and I think in the end she thought he did as well. So the next book, this is not the first one in the series, this is just a random one I grabbed, but this is the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlene Harris. I'm sure you guys know the TV series True Blood is based off of the series. I think there's maybe 11 books out right now. I read the first 7 and then I kind of stopped because I just wanted to read other books. But I think if you've watched True Blood, this show matches the tone of these books very well. This is about a young woman named Sookie Stackhouse living in Louisiana. She's a telepathic waitress, but she's trying to keep that a secret, obviously. And at this time, vampires come out of the closet. I know I've talked about the Anita Blake vampire series, and I think this is a bit of a more lighthearted version. Now, these do have a lot of violence and a lot of sex, so I would recommend just knowing that before you get into them. They are a lot like the show, but they're also just incredibly funny. So I would recommend these if you want a vampire book that's dark, but also really entertaining and fun. A lot of these came out, I think, right after Twilight, and you know, I just started eating them up like candy because I always love vampires so much. I'm not saying that these are the best books in the world, but they are all really fun. So if you just want to read an entertaining vampire book, check these next 3 out. The first one is Vampire Kisses by Ellen Schreiber. I believe this is part of a series, but this is the only one that I own. Obsidian is a book that's really popular right now, and I have not read that, but from what I know about it, this kind of feels like it'd be the vampire version of it. A girl is obsessed with vampires, of course, and then a vampire family, of course, happens to move in next door. I only read the first book in the series, but I know when these were popular, a lot of my friends had read the entire series and really recommended it. Now, this next book has an absolutely hideous cover, so please don't judge it on that, but this is Got Fangs by Katie Maxwell. I think I picked this up for $1. I remember one reason that I enjoyed this was I read it when I was, I believe, 15, and I've always been quite tall, but the character in this book, I think she's about 6'1". I love the setting and the characters in this book. It's just incredibly funny. The main character is, I think she's like 17 or 16, but she's grown up in this sort of traveling fair because of her mother. Their most current place where they stop is in Hungary, and I think I've always loved reading about different countries, so that's why I really devoured this book. But I remember this one just being so funny, and I loved the setting and all of the characters. I know I said the next 3 were kind of cheesier tween books, but this one actually isn't. This is a book I mentioned in my underrated YA reads. I'll link that video down below. But this is Confessions of the Night by Vivian Van Velde. This is a difficult book to talk about without giving anything away, but essentially a girl goes to the laundromat in the middle of the night for one reason or another, and she comes upon sort of a kidnapping situation, and a young man is being sort of beaten up, and they're saying that they're going to kill him, so she attempts to save him. This book just punches me in the heart every time I read it. It's much more mature than I think you would think based on the cover and the short synopsis I just gave you, but I highly recommend this if you want a really good, quick vampire read. I think the world of the vampires in this book is really interesting. It's a standalone. I wish so much it was part of a series because I want to see what happens next, but you know, it's a really bittersweet book, but it's one of my favorites of all time. Next is a I didn't realize how sexual the cover was of the one that I happened to grab, but this is one book I have like 11 of these. This is a series I talked about fairly recently, and that's the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series. The first one is called Guilty Pleasures. Obviously you can tell from what I just said, this is about Anita Blake, who is a very tough-ass vampire hunter, and there are vampires, werewolves, you know, every other kind of animal in this series. Still coming out with books, and they just won't end, which is a problem I have with the series. Picture like the True Blood show in terms of sex and violence, and then multiply that by like 10, and that's what you get with these books. At the same time that they do have their funny moments, and they're incredibly gripping. They're just an endless number of characters in these books, but you do kind of end up falling for all of them, and it's also pretty well written. And next, of course, this book had to be mentioned, and that is Dracula. This is a bind-up of Dracula and Frankenstein, but I've only read Dracula. Now, I read Dracula when I was really young, and I really enjoyed it then, so I think even if you don't tend to read classics and you're worried about it being a little bit slow, I still would recommend it. It has this very dark, somber atmosphere, and of course it's not as action-packed and fast-moving as a lot of books I think we have today, but even when I was little reading it, I could recognize why it was a classic and why it was so popular. And I think if you love vampire books, you just have to read Dracula to know what everything is based off of. Next, I have The Coldest Girl in Cold Town, and I have a review of this up on my channel, so I won't talk about it too much. But this is an autographed copy by Holly Black. I absolutely love the cover. This is about a girl who lives in a world a bit like True Blood, where vampires have just kind of opened up about who they are, but they are forced to live in these kind of walled-off cities called Cold Town. And of course, for one reason or another, she ends up having to go in. I love the world that was created here. And again, if you want to see a review of it, I have it up already. Next is a vampire book that is just so different than any of the ones I have mentioned prior to this, and that is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. This takes place between two different points of view. A girl's father, who is a historian, has gone missing, so she's attempting to find him. It deals a lot with history, as you can tell. It's called The Historian. It's incredibly detailed, quite slow in some parts. I wouldn't recommend it if you want some type of, you know, bloody, typical these days vampire book. Well, I would compare the tone of the book much more so, obviously, to say Dracula than the Anita Blake vampire series. A final book I would recommend I don't own, but this is another YA book, and that is Silver Kiss. And I know by the title it just sounds extremely cheesy, but I can guarantee you it's not. It's much more along the lines of, say, Companions of the Night. Or another one of those kind of atypical, bittersweet, somber, very introspective YA books, so I would really recommend that one. So if any of you guys have been reluctant to check out vampire books just because you're sick to death of hearing about them, which I completely understand, hopefully maybe I sparked your interest a little bit. I just think the subject of vampires is just so timeless. Again, if you have a favorite vampire book you'd like to recommend to me or anybody else, make sure to put it down below, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.